Welcome to the useless hour. Tonight, we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. So, set the day down. Whatever it asks of you, it has already taken, and it is over now. There is nothing left to answer, nothing left to carry, no hour left to keep. Tonight we are not going anywhere grand. We are not going to Rome, or to a battlefield, or to the court of a king. Tonight we are going to sit quietly with a color, a perfectly ordinary, perfectly unremarkable color that has, against all reasonable expectation, a genuine history. Come with me, slowly, and let the present loosen its hold. Tonight's subject is beige. You do not need to remember any of this. If you happen to fall asleep before we reach the end, that is exactly what this is for. So let us begin, gently, with a color that has never once raised anyone's pulse. Beige is, technically speaking, an unsaturated pale brown, a color sitting so precisely between colors that for most of human history nobody thought it deserved a name of its own. Consider that for a moment, slowly, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. Red has been red for as long as anyone can say. Blue has been blue since before writing existed. But beige is different. Beige is what is left over when a color has almost, but not quite, decided to be something. It is the color of things that were never dyed, never painted, never chosen, the color of raw wool and unbleached linen, and wet sand a little while after the tide has gone out. For most of history, it was simply the absence of a decision. The word itself comes from French, and it did not originally mean a color at all. It meant undyed woolen cloth, fabric taken straight from the sheep, spun and woven, but never treated with dye of any kind. A beige coat in the 1700s was not a coat of a certain shade. It was a coat made from wool that nobody had bothered, or perhaps could not afford, to color. It was the natural, unglamorous, entirely unremarkable color of a garment that simply had not been finished yet, worn mostly by monks, by peasants, and by anyone who found dye too expensive to trouble with. So, the very first beige things in Europe were, in a sense, apologies. They were what you wore while waiting for a proper color. It took a surprisingly long time, the better part of 2 centuries, for the word to drift from meaning undyed wool to meaning the color that undyed wool happens to be. The two ideas sat side by side for generations, wool and shade slowly merging in the public mind, the way a nickname eventually replaces a person's real name without anyone quite agreeing to it. By the 1800s, dictionaries had begun to separate the two meanings out, and beige, the color, finally stood on its own, no longer a fabric that happened to look a certain way, but a shade you could point to on a swatch and simply call beige, whether or not any sheep had ever been involved. And here is something most people never learn, and it is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet. Beige did not become fashionable because anyone found it beautiful. It became fashionable because it was cheap. Dye, for most of human history, was extraordinarily expensive. A rich, saturated purple could cost more than the garment itself, made as it was from thousands of crushed sea snails harvested by hand along Mediterranean coastlines in a process so laborious that purple became quite literally the color of emperors, because only an emperor's treasury could pay for it. Deep reds and blues were nearly as dear, drawn from rare insects and precious minerals shipped across continents. Against all of that, beige cost nothing at all. It was simply what wool looked like before anyone spent a single coin on it. So for centuries, the color of the poor was, quite unglamorously, no color at all.
Long before beige asked to be admired for its restraint, the world was still learning how to make color itself obedient. And this part of the story begins not in a living room, but in a laboratory in London in the year 1856, where an 18-year-old chemistry student named William Perkin was attempting, and failing, to synthesize quinine from coal tar. You do not need to remember his name. What matters is what he found instead: a strange purple residue, stable, brilliant, and utterly unlike anything the dye trade had produced before. He called it movine, and within a few years it had done something no one entirely expected. It had made bright, saturated color cheap. For the first time in human history, purple, a color so historically expensive it had been reserved for emperors, could be worn by a shopkeeper's wife. This is the detail worth sitting with, slowly, because it changes what beige meant. Before synthetic dye, undyed wool was cheap because dyeing was hard. After it, undyed wool was cheap because dyeing had become easy for everyone else. Beige did not change color. The world around it changed, and beige simply stayed still. And in staying still, it quietly became something new, not the absence of money, but the absence of noise, in a century that had just discovered how to be very, very loud. Here is something most people never learned, and there is no reason you should have. While the aniline dye boom was busy inventing violent purples, fuchsias, and magentas for parlors and party dresses, an entirely separate and much quieter development was taking place several thousand miles away in the hills of British colonial India, and it had nothing to do with fashion at all. It had to do with staying alive and staying unseen. The word itself, before it was a color on anyone's chart, was Persian and Urdu, khak, meaning dust or earth, and the adjective khaki simply meant dust-colored, the color of the ground underfoot in the dry season. You do not need to remember the etymology, just let it settle. A word that once meant nothing grander than dirt would, within a single century, become the defining color of modern warfare. The credit for bringing khaki into military use generally goes to a British officer named Harry Lumsden, who in 1846, while raising a paramilitary unit in Punjab that would become known as the Corps of Guides, decided that the traditional bright red coat of the British infantryman was, quite simply, a liability. Red had made sense on European battlefields of an earlier age, when armies needed to identify their own men through smoke and distance, and when the etiquette of war still assumed you wanted to be seen. It made no sense at all in the scrub and dust of the northwest frontier, where a red coat was less a uniform than an invitation. Lumsden's men took their white drill uniforms and dyed them informally and by hand, using whatever was on hand: mud, curry powder, tea, the dust of the ground itself, until the cloth matched the land around them. It was not yet a regulation. It was closer to a discovered truth, one soldier's improvisation quietly proving something the entire British Army would eventually have to accept: that visibility on a real battlefield was not a virtue. That truth spread slowly, the way real change usually does, without ceremony. By the 1860s and 70s, khaki drill was showing up more formally in Indian regiments, and by the time of later colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia, it had moved from local improvisation to standard issue.
The full empire-wide adoption took decades, not a single decree. But by the Second Boer War, at the turn of the 20th century, the British Army had learned its lesson in the most costly way possible, watching red-coated soldiers suffer against Boer marksmen who wore drab, earth-toned clothing and seemed to simply vanish into the landscape. After that war, khaki was no longer an exception carried by frontier regiments. It was the uniform. You do not need to remember the regiments, or the campaigns, or the treaties that followed. What is worth carrying with you, slowly, is the underlying idea, because it is the same idea that would eventually settle into a beige sofa in an American suburb, that this color's entire power came from refusing to announce itself. Red said, "Here I am." Khaki, and the wider family of dust colors and beiges that followed it, said nothing at all, and said it on purpose. The First World War is where this quiet color met its most famous garment, though the garment itself had been taking shape for a few decades already. In the 1850s and 60s, a Hampshire draper named Thomas Burberry had been experimenting with a tightly woven, weatherproofed cotton twill, treating the yarn itself before weaving rather than coating the finished cloth so that the fabric could breathe while still shedding rain. He patented the process in 1888 and gave it a name that has outlived almost everything else from that century of invention: gabardine. A rival house, Aquascutum, whose very name is Latin for water shield, had been working the same problem from a different angle since the 1850s, and between them, Britain now had a fabric that soldiers, and eventually everyone else, would come to depend on. When war broke out in 1914 and armies dug themselves into the long earthen wounds of the Western Front, British officers needed something to wear over their uniforms in trenches that were, by design and by weather, almost permanently wet, cold, and the color of mud. Burberry had already been supplying weatherproof coats to officers before the war, and wartime demand simply confirmed what the design had already proven: a belted, roomy coat cut in that same dust and earth palette, with storm flaps at the shoulder to let rain run clear, and D-rings at the waist, originally meant for map cases and equipment, not, whatever later legend claimed, for grenades. Officers were required to purchase their own coats under what was known as the Threadbare Guide to Uniform Regulations, and thousands of them chose these coats from Burberry and Aquascutum, coats that were practical first and only became fashionable afterward, once the surviving officers came home wearing them, and the wider public wanted, whether they understood why or not, to wear the same color. It is worth resting on this for a moment, unhurried, the way this color itself asks to be considered. Camouflage, as a designed, patterned science, did not yet exist in any serious military sense in this period. There were no disruptive patterns, no digital pixelation, none of the tools a modern soldier would recognize. What existed instead was something much simpler, and in its way much older. The observation that a color matching the ground around you is a color the eye slides past. Dust-colored cloth against dust-colored earth, a beige coat against a churned, colorless field. The trench coat was never meant to hide a man completely. It was meant to make him slightly less worth noticing, and in the long, exhausting arithmetic of trench warfare, slightly less worth noticing was sometimes the whole difference. So carry this thought gently into whatever comes next. The same undyed, unassuming color that had once simply meant a person too poor to afford a dye vat had, within the span of one long century, been reissued twice over, once by chemists who made every loud color cheap and left beige looking deliberate by comparison, and once by soldiers who discovered in the dust of a foreign hillside that not being seen could be its own kind of protection. Mid-century design did not arrive at beige by accident. It arrived at it by argument. The Bauhaus school, founded in Weimar in 1919 and closed by the Nazi government in 1933, had spent over a decade insisting that ornament was a kind of dishonesty, that a chair should look like what it did rather than what it wished to be, and that color, when used at all, should serve the form rather than decorate it. When figures trained in or influenced by that tradition scattered to Chicago, to Cambridge, to Los Angeles, they carried this instinct with them, and it met, quite by coincidence, a booming Scandinavian design culture that was arriving at nearly the same conclusion from a different direction entirely. Not philosophical austerity so much as a practical response to long winters and short daylight, where pale, warm, undyed-looking materials made rooms feel less like enclosures. You do not need to remember any of this. It is simply worth noting that two design cultures, one born from a manifesto and one born from a climate, met in the middle of the 20th century at more or less the same shade of oatmeal. What is more interesting, and almost nobody stops to consider while standing in their own hallway, is that beige eventually stopped being a design decision and became a sales strategy. Real estate agents in the latter half of the 20th century began to formalize something that furniture showrooms had already sensed intuitively, that a room painted in a strong, specific color asks a stranger to imagine living inside somebody else's decision, while a room painted in a neutral tone asks nothing of the stranger at all. This is now a well-documented principle in home staging, discussed at length in real estate trade literature, and echoed by professional stagers across English-speaking property markets. And the underlying mechanism, when people bother to explain it, comes down to something almost embarrassingly simple. A buyer walking through a house is not evaluating the house. They are auditioning themselves inside it. A saturated color on a wall is, in effect, a photograph of somebody else's taste, and photographs of other people are difficult to mentally erase. A neutral wall, by contrast, behaves less like a photograph and more like a blank slide in a projector, and the buyer's own furniture, own life, own future mail sitting on an own kitchen counter gets projected onto it without resistance. The color is not being chosen for its beauty, it is being chosen for its silence. This is, incidentally, the same reasoning that shows up in the psychology of perceived space, where lighter, low-saturation tones are consistently found to make rooms register as larger and calmer than they measure on a tape. The effect is not exotic. It draws on ordinary and well-replicated principles of how the visual system processes light versus dark, reflective versus absorptive surfaces. Pale walls bounce more ambient light around a room, which reduces the shadow gradients the eye uses to judge where a wall actually ends, which in turn makes the boundary of the room slightly harder to pin down, which the brain tends to interpret reliably and a little foolishly as more space rather than less certainty. Nobody needs to have read the research to have felt this. Anyone who has stood in a small, brightly lit beige room and a small, dark red one has already run the experiment personally, without a clipboard, without a lab coat, and without knowing that it had a name. Somewhere in the early 2000s, the beige story took on a new word, and paint companies who are not in the business of leaving good things unnamed called it greige.
grey folded into beige, beige folded into grey. A color that manages to be two boring things at once, and by combining them becomes very slightly less boring than either. Greige rose through the 2000s and 2010s to become one of the defining interior tones of that era's residential paint market, a fact reflected in how consistently grey-beige blends topped bestseller lists and Color of the Year shortlists across major paint manufacturers through those 2 decades. Sherwin-Williams' agreeable grey became, in that period, something close to a household name among people who could otherwise not name a single paint color. Repeatedly cited among the brand's most requested shades and leaned on by realtors and flippers as something close to a default choice, a color so popular it earned its own minor reputation, sometimes admiring and sometimes weary, for being the wall color behind roughly half of the real estate listing photographs a person might scroll past in a given week. You do not need to remember the name of a specific paint color to fall asleep tonight. It is enough to know that somewhere, on a wall you have never seen, in a house you will never enter, that exact grey-beige is very likely drying at this moment, chosen not because anyone loved it, but because no one, presented with it, could think of a single reason to object.
The polo coat arrives first, and it arrives appropriately as a garment designed to be worn while doing nothing in particular. The story, as it is generally told and as it survives in the archives of English tailoring, begins on the sidelines of polo matches in the 1990s and early 1900s, where players stepped off their horses between chukkers and needed something to throw over their shoulders against the chill. What they reached for was a loose wrap-front coat, double-breasted, belted, cut from camel hair, for the simple reason that camel hair is warm without being heavy, and undyed, because camel hair in its natural state is already the color the industry would later decide to name it after it. This was not a fashion choice in the sense we now use the term. It was a practical solution to the problem of standing still in cold English weather, and the color was incidental, a byproduct of using the animal's coat as it came, without the expense or effort of dyeing it into something else. The coat crossed the Atlantic, as so many things did in that period, and found its second and more permanent home not on polo ground, but on the campuses of the American Northeast, where in the 1920s it became a fixture of what would come to be called Ivy League style. Students at Princeton and Yale adopted the polo coat as outerwear for exactly the setting it was never designed for, which is to say, sitting in the stands watching other people's games, specifically football games, wrapped in camel-colored wool, with the collar up, looking, by all surviving photographic evidence, extremely pleased with themselves. The coat's migration from equestrian sideline to college sideline preserved its essential shape and its essential color, and by the middle of the 20th century, the camel coat had settled into the permanent vocabulary of American menswear, filed alongside the blazer and the button-down collar as a piece that signaled, quietly, that the wearer had been somewhere with money and had brought the coat back with him. It has not left that vocabulary since. It is, at time of recording, still sold by the same houses, in the same cut, described in the same language, as a garment whose entire aesthetic claim rests on looking exactly like undyed wool, because it is undyed wool, because 80 years of continuous fashion history have concluded that undyed wool cannot be improved upon. The next chapter takes place at a considerable historical remove, in the 1990s, when a very different generation of designers arrived independently at a very similar conclusion. Calvin Klein, working out of New York, and Jill Sander, working out of Hamburg, are both credited in the fashion press of the period, and in the retrospectives written since, with defining a movement that came to be called minimalism, and both did so substantially through the color beige, along with its close relatives, ivory, stone, and taupe. The context matters here. The 1980s had been, by design historical consensus, a decade of excess in fashion. Shoulder pads, bright color, visible logos, clothing that announced itself. What Klein and Sander offered in the decade that followed was clothing that declined to announce anything, cut with exacting precision from fabrics that were often more expensive than the loud clothes they were replacing, but rendered in tones so quiet that the expense had to be inferred rather than seen. Klein's advertising and runway work through the 1990s repeatedly returned to a palette of neutrals worn by models photographed in stark, uncluttered settings, and Sander earned, from fashion journalists of the period, the nickname Queen of Less for a body of work built on architectural tailoring in almost aggressively unadorned color. Neither designer invented beige. What they did, and what the historical record credits them with doing, was strip away everything else until beige and its neighbors were not the absence of a design decision, but the entire design decision, which is a different thing and a harder one to execute. It is worth pausing on the shape of that idea because it recurs. Roughly 3 decades after Klein and Sander made restraint into a statement, fashion journalism began again to notice wealthy people declining to advertise the fact, and again reached for the same palette to describe it. The phenomenon acquired the name quiet luxury, sometimes rendered as stealth wealth, and it became, through 2022 and 2023 in particular, one of the most extensively documented style movements of the decade, covered at length in the trade press and the general press alike, and given a considerable boost by a television series about an extremely wealthy family whose costume design leaned hard into exactly this look. The brands most closely associated with the trend, The Row, founded by Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, and Loro Piana, the Italian house long favored for its cashmere, share a set of traits that the coverage returned to again and again. Garments without visible branding, without logos, constructed from materials expensive enough that their quality could be recognized only by those who already knew what to look for, in a color range dominated by cream, camel, and beige. The argument made by commentators at the time was that this was a deliberate inversion of the logo-driven maximalism of the preceding years. Wealth signaled not through visible expense, but through the confidence of appearing to have made no effort at all, which is itself, of course, a great deal of effort, and a great deal of money aimed at looking like neither. The final development belongs not to the runway, but to the internet, and it is worth recording with the same care given to the rest because it is a genuine and well-documented piece of linguistic history, however small. In 2023, a term began circulating widely on TikTok and across other social platforms, the beige flag. It arrived as a deliberate variation on an existing pair of terms, the red flag, denoting a serious warning sign in a romantic partner, and the green flag, denoting a reassuring sign of compatibility. The beige flag was coined to describe something in between, or rather beside the point of both, a trait in a partner that was neither alarming nor admirable, but simply distinctly odd, a strange, specific habit or preoccupation mentioned with a kind of affectionate bewilderment, neither disqualifying nor especially meaningful, just noted. The term was covered, in the months after its emergence, by outlets tracking internet slang as a genuine addition to the vocabulary of online dating discourse, its popularity resting entirely on the same quality that had made the color useful to wool traders 8 centuries earlier and to Jill Sander a few decades before that. Beige, as a word and as a color, has always meant the presence of something too mild to be alarming and too particular to be nothing at all. And the Internet, confronted with a gap in its vocabulary for exactly that feeling, reached for the one color whose entire history had been preparing it for the job. The Apple II, released in 1977, arrived in a warm off-white case that the Apple designers referred to internally as a specific shade, and within a handful of years, nearly every personal computer sold anywhere in the world had settled, without much public debate, on some close variation of the same tone. This was not an aesthetic movement in the way that, say, mid-century modern furniture was a movement, with manifestos and named designers arguing for a particular vision of the future. It was closer to a quiet, industry-wide shrug toward the path of least resistance, and the reasons for that shrug are worth sitting with, because they are duller and more interesting than most people assume. Beige plastic, in the specific case of computer housings, was cheap. It required less pigment than a true white, which meant marginal lower material costs multiplied across millions of units, and at the volumes IBM, Apple, Commodore, and their many clone manufacturers were operating at by the mid-1980s, marginal savings on pigment were not trivial. But cost was only part of it. The more persistent reason, the one that shows up again and again in the recollections of engineers and designers who worked on these machines, is that beige hid things. It hid the dust that a fan-cooled box sitting on an office desk for years accumulates as a matter of course. It hid the faint scuffs and handling marks of a device that gets touched, moved, and cleaned with whatever rag happens to be nearby. And it hid, or was believed to hide, the very discoloration that these plastics were, unbeknownst to nearly everyone buying them at the time, already beginning to develop. That discoloration deserves to be described carefully, because it is one of those rare cases where a piece of decades-old consumer trivia turns out to rest on a real, documented, and fairly elegant bit of material science. The plastic housings used in beige-era computers, almost universally a type of ABS plastic, were treated with brominated flame retardants, chemical compounds added specifically to keep the plastic from readily catching fire, a genuinely sensible precaution for a box full of electricity sitting in someone's home or office. Over years of exposure to ultraviolet light, whether from sunlight through an office window or simply ambient indoor lighting, those bromine compounds underwent a slow photochemical reaction, breaking down and forming new compounds within the plastic itself that carried a yellowish, sometimes brownish tint. The plastic was not accumulating dirt, and it was not fading in the ordinary sense that a colored fabric fades in the sun. It was chemically transforming, degrading in a way that changed its optical properties from the inside out, and doing so slowly enough that almost nobody watched it happen in real time. They simply, one day, noticed that the beige computer that had sat by the window for 8 years looked distinctly less beige and distinctly more the color of a nicotine-stained ceiling than the one that had lived in a drawer. This phenomenon has, in the years since, acquired its own small, dedicated body of hobbyist knowledge. People who collect and restore vintage computers refer to it plainly as yellowing, and they have developed a countermeasure, a process generally known as retrobrighting, which uses a mixture of hydrogen peroxide and ultraviolet light to reverse the discoloration, by continuing and then halting the same chemical reaction that caused it in the first place, essentially bleaching the plastic back towards something closer to its original tone. It is a strange loop to sit with, a preservation community using more UV light to undo the damage that UV light originally caused on plastic that was made beige specifically so nobody would notice it changing color, and which then proceeded to change color anyway, more dramatically than almost any other tone could. Had these machines been manufactured in black or in a deep navy, the same chemical reaction would have been occurring in the plastic the entire time, entirely unnoticed, hidden by a base color dark enough to absorb the shift. Beige, in this narrow sense, may have been the one shade uniquely positioned to reveal its own slow decay.
The industry's relationship with beige as a computing default held remarkably steady for roughly 2 decades, through the rise of the IBM PC in 1981, through the flood of PC clones that followed it through the 1980s, and into the early 1990s, by which point beige had become so thoroughly synonymous with computing that it functioned almost as a category signal, telling a buyer at a glance that the object in front of them was a serious, work-appropriate machine rather than a toy. That association is precisely what made the break, when it came, land as hard as it did. In May of 1998, Apple released the iMac G3, a computer housed not in beige plastic, but in a rounded, translucent shell of Bondi blue, a shade of blue-green named, according to Apple's own design team, after Sydney's Bondi Beach. The case was semi-transparent, allowing a hint of the internal components to show through, a deliberate design choice by Jonathan Ive and Apple's industrial design group under Steve Jobs, who had returned to the company only the prior year. The iMac was not simply painted a different color from its predecessors, it was engineered from the outset around the idea that a personal computer's exterior could be an object of desire rather than an object that disappeared into the background of an office. It sold well, drawing new and returning customers, and within a year or two, Apple had extended the same translucent, candy-colored treatment across a range of colors sold under names like tangerine, grape, lime, and blueberry. The rest of the industry, watching a 14-year design consensus get discarded in a single product launch, followed at varying speeds, and by the early 2000s, the beige tower sitting under an office desk had become something closer to a period artifact than a current product, a shift so complete that industry writers at the time and since have treated the iMac's arrival as a genuine hinge point in consumer electronics design history, the moment computing stopped apologizing for existing in a room. And yet, even as beige receded from computer casings, it never left the built environment, because the same properties that made it useful for hiding a decade of desktop dust make it useful for hiding a decade of institutional wear. Hospital corridors, waiting rooms, rental cars, airline cabin interiors, and government office lobbies have, for just as long as computers were beige, gravitated toward the same narrow family of neutral tans and off-whites. And the reasoning behind that gravitation is nearly identical to the reasoning behind the beige computer case. These are spaces built to be touched, scuffed, sat in, and cleaned by thousands of different people in rapid succession. Spaces where the priority is not that anyone find the color moving or memorable, but that no one find it offensive, and that the inevitable accumulation of scuff marks, stains, and general wear stay as visually unobtrusive as possible for as long as possible before the next repainting or reupholstering cycle.
Designers and facilities managers working in these high-traffic institutional contexts have long treated beige and its close relatives less as an aesthetic choice than as a maintenance strategy, a color selected for its capacity to fail gracefully and inconspicuously under exactly the kind of relentless daily use that a hospital corridor or a rental sedan's interior is guaranteed to receive. It is, in that sense, the same underlying calculation the computer manufacturers made decades ago, applied not to a plastic housing that sits on a desk for years, but to an entire built environment that never stops being touched. The Federal Reserve, 8 times each year, on a schedule set roughly 2 weeks before each meeting of its Federal Open Market Committee, publishes a document that carries the formal, sober title, Summary of Commentary on Current Economic Conditions. It is compiled by committee, reviewed by economists, and used to help steer the monetary policy of the largest economy on Earth, and is known to virtually everyone who has ever had reason to discuss it, from central bankers to journalists to first-year economics students, by one name only, and that name is the Beige Book. Nobody calls it the Summary of Commentary on Current Economic Conditions. Nobody has, really, for decades. It is the Beige Book. And it has been the Beige Book for so long that a great many people who quote it, cite it, and trade on the strength of its findings could not tell you what its actual formal title is, only that its cover, when it was first assembled and circulated internally in the 1970s, was beige, and that this fact of interior design outlived every attempt at formality the institution ever made.
Consider for a moment the scale of what is being named after a folder. The Beige Book is not a footnote in American economic life. It is read closely by market analysts trying to anticipate the Federal Reserve's next move on interest rates. It is passed sentence by sentence by financial journalists searching for shifts in language that might signal a change in tone from modest growth to moderate growth, distinctions the market treats as meaningfully different from one another. It has been published under that plain, undecorated color scheme since 1983, when the Federal Reserve began releasing it to the public rather than keeping it strictly internal. And even now, in an age of full-color digital publishing, where the paper cover itself has become almost entirely symbolic, the tradition holds. The document still travels under the identity granted to it by an accident of binding stock decades ago, by whoever ordered the cover paper for a Federal Reserve internal report and reached, for reasons lost to institutional memory, for the beige. It is worth sitting with the fact that one of the primary instruments by which the world's most powerful central bank communicates its read on the health of the American economy is, and has been for over 40 years, colloquially named after being the color of a manila folder that someone did not think twice about. It should be said, in fairness to the Federal Reserve, that this was never intended as commentary on the color itself. There is no evidence, none, that anyone in Washington chose beige as a signal of caution or restraint, or the deliberate absence of alarm, though it is difficult, having learned what beige has meant throughout the rest of this history, not to notice how well it suits an institution whose entire public communication strategy is engineered around not spooking anyone. The other Federal Reserve publications, incidentally, received color nicknames of their own, entirely by the same logic. There is a tan book and a green book among the historical record of Federal Reserve document colors, named the same way for the same reason, because someone ordered a particular shade of cover stock, and the name simply stuck to the contents.
Of all of them, only the Beige Book endures in the public imagination, likely because beige itself, as this program has already spent a great deal of time establishing, is a color uniquely suited to being remembered for absolutely nothing except its own presence.
Beyond the vault of the Federal Reserve, there exists an entirely different and much older question. And that is the question of how you take a word like beige, a word that, as established, was born out of vagueness, out of undyed wool and the simple absence of dye, rather than any positive act of description, and turn it into something an industry can actually build with. A paint company cannot manufacture beige in the way a poet might invoke it, as a mood, an implication, a house that felt a certain way in memory. A paint company needs a formula. A printer running a 4-color press needs a set of exact percentages. A textile mill dyeing wool for 10,000 overcoats needs the batch dyed in November to match precisely the batch dyed the following March. And so, over the course of the 20th century, several rival systems arose with the specific purpose of taking colors exactly like beige, colors that live natively in the fog of human vibe and personal judgment, and pinning them down into something reproducible, transferable, and legally enforceable across a supply chain that might span several continents. The Munsell system, developed in the early 1900s by an American painter and art teacher who grew frustrated with the vagueness of color language, approached the problem the way a scientist approaches a specimen. It organized every color along 3 measurable dimensions, describing not just the hue itself, but how light or dark it was, and how intense or muted, so that a shade like beige could be located as a specific coordinate in a 3-dimensional space, rather than gestured at with an adjective. Decades later, the Pantone matching system took a more commercial and famously practical approach, assigning standardized numbered colors that a designer in one country and a printer in another could both reference and trust would produce an identical result, turning color from a matter of taste into a matter of lookup. In Europe, industry adopted the RAL color standard for much the same purpose in paints, coatings, and plastics, giving manufacturers a shared numeric reference so that a beige specified for a window frame in Hamburg would still be recognizably the same beige when it arrived molded and painted from a factory elsewhere on the continent. What all 3 systems share, despite their differences in method and origin, is the same underlying ambition: to rescue a word as slippery as beige from the realm of opinion and install it permanently as a fixed and repeatable fact, so that an industry that depends on consistency need never again wonder whether one man's beige is another man's greige. The crayon that concerns us now was born in the year 1949 in the crowded, waxy nursery of the Crayola product line, where it was given the name Flesh. It was a pale, pinkish orange, warm and unremarkable, indistinguishable in hue from a dozen other crayons that would go on to have long and blameless careers. But this one crayon carried, folded quietly into its paper wrapper, an assumption. The assumption that there existed one flesh, one skin, one default human coloring against which all others were variations or exceptions. For 13 years, in schoolrooms and at kitchen tables across the country, children reached for this particular crayon to color in hands and faces, and the label told them, without elaboration, what color a person was. In 1962, the name was retired. Crayola changed it to peach. The company has since said, in its own official telling of its own history, that the renaming came in the context of the civil rights movement and of a growing and overdue recognition that no single crayon could be reasonably asked to stand in for the whole of human skin. It is a small correction, as corrections go, a few molecules of pigmented paraffin wax relabeled, and it is also, if you sit with it long enough, an entire chapter of cultural history compressed into a change of 6 letters on a wrapper. Nobody rang a bell, no parade was held for the crayon. It simply went back into the 64-count box under its new and more modest name, sorted now among the fruits rather than among the people, and it has stayed there since, peaceably, for well over 60 years, doing the ordinary work of shading in sunsets and the flesh of peaches, which was, it turned out, a much more accurate job for it all along. We move now with the same unhurried attention to a different room entirely. Not a classroom, but a kitchen table at 6:30 in the evening, where a small plate sits in front of a small child. On the plate, a chicken nugget, shaped by an industrial press into the approximate silhouette of a chicken, though its resemblance to any bird now ends at the outline. Beside it, a modest hill of plain pasta, unsauced, unbuttered in the more ambitious households, buttered in the wiser ones. A cracker, unadorned, perhaps a scoop of white rice holding its shape with the quiet dignity of a dune. This is the diet that parents, pediatric dietitians, and occupational therapists have, over the course of many years and countless dinner tables, come to refer to, informally but consistently, as beige food, or the beige diet, a phrase that carries no scientific weight and yet turns up again in parenting columns, feeding clinics, and support forums, because it names something that a great many families recognize on sight. It is worth being precise about what is actually happening on that plate. Many young children, as a matter of ordinary development, move through a phase of narrowing their food preferences, a phenomenon sometimes called food neophobia, the wariness of the new, which shows itself as a marked and often stubborn preference for foods that are familiar, mild in flavor, uniform in texture, and unlikely to contain any element of ambush. Starch tends to dominate. Sauce tends to be viewed with suspicion on the reasonable grounds that sauce conceals things. Color, ironically, is often the very quality being avoided. A green fleck, a fibrous strand, a visible seed, any of these can be enough to end the negotiation before it begins. For most children, this phase is temporary, a passing chapter that resolves itself gradually, given patience and repeated gentle exposure into a wider and more colorful plate. For some children, and for some adults as well, it does not resolve on its own, and the pattern is more than a phase. It shades into what clinicians now recognize under the name ARFID, Avoidant/Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, a diagnosis that has only in recent years been given its own formal category, separate from anorexia or bulimia, precisely because its roots are different. ARFID is frequently connected not to concerns about weight or appearance at all, but to sensory processing, to a nervous system that registers texture, smell, temperature, and appearance with an intensity that makes certain foods genuinely difficult, sometimes genuinely distressing, to eat. It appears with particular frequency, though not exclusively, among autistic children and adults, for whom the sensory experience of food, the specific give of a nugget's exterior against its interior, the specific blandness of a cracker,
The specific predictability of white rice is not a preference so much as a requirement, a small and manageable island of certainty in a world that offers a great many textures with far less warning. The scholars and clinicians who study this, for it is, whatever its unassuming name suggests, a subject of genuine and increasingly serious study, are careful to say that the beige plate should not be mistaken for a failure of parenting, nor for simple pickiness that a firmer hand could correct, nor for a habit to be shamed out of a child through force of will. Occupational therapists who work with sensory feeding difficulties describe long, patient processes of exposure, of letting a child simply look at a new food, then touch it, then have it sit companionably on the edge of the plate for several dinners running, before any expectation of tasting is introduced at all. Progress, when it comes by the inch. It is, in its own quiet way, as considered and as consequential a discipline as anything practiced by the surgeons and generals whose stories usually populate an hour such as this one, and it deserves, at the very least, the same unhurried respect. And so the beige plate takes its place in this history beside the beige crayon, the beige overcoat, and the beige committee report, not as a joke at anyone's expense, but as one more instance of a color that keeps turning up, without fanfare, at the exact moments when caution, comfort, or the plain avoidance of complication are what is required. The chicken nugget asks nothing of the eye, and very little of the nerve. It has, in this respect, more in common with the Federal Reserve's own beige publication than either institution would likely care to admit. Both are, after all, unglamorous instruments designed to keep a delicate system running smoothly, one meal or one quarter at a time. Sleep well now, settling over your quiet room. And everything that has passed through this hour, the etymology, the khaki, the paint chips, the coats, the beige box on the desk, has been circling, without ever quite saying so, around one small and steady observation. Beige has never once been an accident. Every era we've walked through tonight chose it on purpose for the same quiet reason. The undyed wool of centuries ago wasn't refusing color because color didn't exist. It was refusing the cost and the attention that color demanded, and staying plain was itself the decision. The khaki uniform wasn't neutral by nature. Someone in a hot, dusty campaign decided that not being seen mattered more than looking impressive. The greige wall in the mid-century living room wasn't a failure of imagination. It was a household deciding deliberately that the room should not compete with the people living in it. The camel coat, the quiet luxury wardrobe, the beige flag joke, all of it the same instinct dressed differently, a recognition that sometimes the most expensive, most confident thing a person can do is decline to perform. And the beige computer, the beige hospital corridor, the beige rental car, those weren't chosen for beauty at all, but because a shade that asks for nothing is a shade that offends no one, soothes without announcing itself, and disappears exactly when disappearing is the point. And here, at the end, is the small detail worth sitting with before we close the book on this. Most color words in English trace back to something the world simply handed us. Orange from the fruit, violet from the flower, the sky lending its blue. Beige did not arrive that way. It came from a French word for fabric left in its natural, unbleached state, cloth exactly as the loom produced it before anyone had done anything to it at all. Which means, quietly, that the color named itself after the act of leaving something alone. Even its own word is a small monument to restraint.
So if there has been a through line running under 6 parts of etymology and uniforms and paint charts and rental cars, it is this. In every century we visited tonight, in every room, someone looked at all the available color in the world and chose on purpose the one that would ask for nothing back. Not because they lacked imagination, but because they understood, in whatever language their era spoke, that quiet has its own kind of authority. That's the whole pointless, oddly moving history of beige.
And now, if you'll let your attention drift for a moment from all of that, back to the room you're actually lying in, notice how in this light, or this near absence of it, the walls have already stopped being any particular color at all. The paint you chose or didn't choose, the curtains, the ceiling above you, they've all quietly surrendered their names to the dark, settling into that same soft, undyed, unbothered shade that asks nothing of you and offers nothing but rest. Everything in the room has gone beige tonight in its own way, simply by being still long enough. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.